all people are going to do is smoke more to get the same amount of nicotine. It's actually going to have the opposite of the effect they say they want.
So I'm sure, as most of you have heard at this point, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, under the direction of President Biden, issued a marketing denial order, which, in effect, made it illegal for stores to sell Juul Labs e-cigarettes and related paraphernalia. A federal appeals court has since put a temporary block on this government ban, as Juul has put in an appeal to challenge this decision. We'll have to wait and see what happens. But this most recent blow against vaping isn't without precedent, and it certainly won't be the last form of government restriction on nicotine products. Back in 2019, Juul stopped selling fruity and sweet-flavored versions of vape juice in the face of an FDA crackdown under the Trump administration, as the FDA started requiring that all vape products be submitted for approval prior to entering the market. Juul has long been criticized for supposedly marketing to minors, who cannot legally vape. The law that allowed this removal of Juul products was passed in April of this year. As U.S. News and World Report reported at the time, the new law allows the FDA to protect the public health from the harms of tobacco products, regardless of the source of nicotine. That's pretty open-ended language, and there are good reasons to believe that the FDA will only reach further. As the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, said after the Juul action was taken, today's action is further progress on the FDA's commitment to ensuring that all e-cigarettes and all electronic nicotine delivery system products currently being marketed to consumers meet our public health standards. The agency has dedicated significant resources to review products from the companies that account for most of the U.S. market. We recognize that these make up a significant part of the available products, and many have played a disproportionate role in the rise of youth vaping. Let me be very clear here. Nicotine use does have its downsides. I can say from first-hand experience that nicotine addiction is no joke. I am a former smoker myself. I started in college when it was legal for people under the age of 21 to smoke, and was up to smoking 2 packs a day by the time I turned 24. It was, by far, the most expensive bad habit I've ever had. These days, I honestly don't even know how normal people can afford to smoke. Like most smokers trying to quit, it took me several tries to actually kick the habit. I'm happy to say, as of this video, it's been almost exactly 7.5 years since I've had any tobacco, and like almost all ex-smokers, I still get cravings once in a while. Nicotine really does imprint itself on your brain at an emotional level that makes quitting all the more difficult. I've never been a vapor, but I know a lot of people who do, and started as a means of quitting cigarettes. And while vaping does have its downsides, they're not nearly as bad as good old-fashioned smoking. I think PragerU's videos are usually hit or miss, but they actually do have a really good video on this topic that I recommend you watch. In previous videos, I've discussed how there isn't one single unified corporate agenda, and how oftentimes, when lobbying the federal and state governments for policy, large corporations oftentimes don't push in a free market direction. The tobacco industry is an excellent example of this. One of the forces behind the FDA's actions against vaping has actually been large cigarette companies. You might think this is weird, as most of the large tobacco companies are significantly invested in the vaping market. Altria Group, for example, the company that owns Philip Morris, the producer of Marlboro, the most widely used cigarette in the United States, has a 35% ownership stake in Juul. Reynolds American, the producer of Camel cigarettes, produces Vuse vapes, which at one point was the largest producer in the United States, until it was overtaken by Juul. British American Tobacco produces Vapor, Imperial produces Blue, and so on and so forth. Every large tobacco company has understandably diversified in this way. So, how are they partially responsible for this? Well, it goes back to the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement of 1998. This is one of the best examples of industry working side by side with the government for the sake of increased regulation. In the United States of America, it's illegal for tobacco companies to advertise on television, magazines, and billboards, though they can advertise in stores that sell cigarettes. The justification for this regulation was typical: the children. As Bill Clinton said in 1995, flanked by the head of the National PTA and the president of the American Medical Association, teenagers are especially susceptible to pressures. Pressures to the manipulation of the mass media, the pressure of the seduction of skilled marketing campaigns aimed at exploiting their insecurities and uncertainties about life. When Joe Camel tells young children that smoking is cool, when billboards tell teens that smoking will lead to true romance, when Virginia Slims tells adolescents that cigarettes will make them thin and glamorous, then our children need our wisdom, our guidance, and our experience. We're their parents, and it is up to us to protect them. The bugbear of the tobacco industry, as Bill Clinton stated, has always been Joe Camel. I never really got that. I always thought Joe Camel looked kinda lame, but I guess that's just me. One of the biggest supporters of these advertising restrictions was actually the big tobacco companies themselves. The companies pushed for these advertising bans in the aforementioned Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement with the federal and state governments. Why would these large companies want to advertise less? It may initially seem counterintuitive, but restrictions on advertising necessarily work in favor of already established brands. As Kip Viscucci wrote in Smoke-Filled Room, a postmortem on the tobacco deal, if the primary effect of advertising is to influence brand choice rather than consumption of a broad class of products, as considerable economic literature suggests, then banning advertising or restricting it in important domains has the effect of locking in the current market shares to the extent that firms cannot advertise new brands. Again, Altria was the largest producer of tobacco at the time. It still is, though it has separated from its international brand, Philip Morris International, and Altria currently has a 35% ownership stake in Juul. Given that Juul got slammed on making advertisements that supposedly targeted young people, this was the chickens coming home to roost, in a sense. This isn't the only way in which Altria's own work came back to haunt them. The Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement is a great example of large firms colluding against smaller ones. The tobacco industry also offers an example of large firms fighting one another over government policy. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration considered expanding the FDA's control over tobacco products. At the time, Altria, which again was the parent company of Philip Morris, actually lobbied in favor of greater FDA control and regulation, with resistance coming from other large tobacco firms. As Tim Carney wrote in The Big Ripoff, Philip Morris controls about half of the domestic tobacco industry. Altria's revenues of $81 billion in 2003 were many times the budget of smaller tobacco companies. Philip Morris could bear the costs associated with complying with greater federal regulation, hiring new lawyers, hiring new lobbyists, creating new labels, and so on, far more easily than its smaller family-owned competitors. The FDA was created in 1938 as part of the New Deal. Congress granted the agency authority to regulate food and consumer drugs, both over-the-counter and prescription. Cigarettes don't fall under either of those categories, though nicotine is a drug, and an addictive one at that. So, using executive action, the Clinton administration sought to expand the FDA's authority over tobacco using exactly this logic. In 2000, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 margin, said that the Clinton administration was not allowed to do this, and that if the government wanted the FDA to have control over nicotine delivery devices, Congress would have to grant the agency the authority. In 2004, Altria and public health advocates tried to slip a provision in the tax bill granting the FDA exactly this authority. Ultimately, the provision never made it into the House version of the bill and never became law, which was a setback for Altria, much to the delight of other tobacco firms. As Tim Carney wrote in The Big Ripoff, in this battle, unlike the Master Settlement Agreement, the rest of Big Tobacco was not on Philip Morris's side. In July, an R.J. Reynolds lawyer lambasted the proposal when it passed the Senate, saying it would create an overwhelming competitive advantage for Philip Morris. As an Altria spokesman told the Richmond Times-Dispatch, "We spent a lot of time and effort on it. We think it's very important to the industry as a whole. We don't have any regrets about pursuing it." Altria eventually got what they wanted years later, and it ended up biting them in the ass when it came to Juul. Though they may win their appeal yet, so I guess we'll see. As of now, the FDA is considering more regulations for traditional cigarettes. As NPR reports, the FDA is poised to set a maximum nicotine level in cigarettes and some other tobacco products, looking to make them less addictive and wean smokers away from the habit. For their part, cigarette companies have been working to adapt to shifts in regulation and in consumer tastes. For instance, the tobacco conglomerate Altria, which includes Philip Morris USA, has previously said it agrees with the FDA that addicted smokers need less harmful alternatives than cigarettes. Now, I have not seen anything to the effect that large tobacco companies support reducing nicotine levels in cigarettes, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did. Why? Well, our old pal Kyle Klinsky points out why it could be incredibly beneficial for them.
What they did with nicotine, that also makes absolutely no sense. All people are going to do is smoke more to get the same amount of nicotine. It's actually going to have the opposite of the effect they say they want.
Again, that's just speculation, but there's certainly some logic to it. What I do know is that there's no guarantee that Big Tobacco will side against regulation. Historically speaking, it's an open question. Finally, I want to close on this point. People who bemoan corporate influence in our government usually talk about corporations and the lobbyists they employ as master of the universe types. Everything might look like chaotic incompetence, but behind the scenes, they're really controlling it all.
You know this Trump administration is a giant distraction, right?
Them Mexicans, man, every piece of shit, I'm Trump, and then everyone's like, oh my god, Trump's bad, Trump's bad. And then a few people are like, no, Trump's good, Trump's good. Oh, how can you say Trump's good when we say Trump's bad? Well, we say he's good. Well, we say he's bad. Well, you. Well, you. We're gonna impeach Trump. Well, if you impeach Trump, we're gonna do the Civil War.
And the people who actually control everything, they just kind of sit around and go.
Distracting people with culture war issues, manufacturing consent to get people to go along with their agenda, pitting Americans against each other while they run out the back door with all the money. I'm sure you all know exactly the sort of thing I'm talking about. The thing is, we all know that corporations can make incredibly stupid decisions. We've all seen terrible movies that were box office flops, or television shows that didn't even make it a season. The people who talk about how CNN manufactures consent are the same ones to gloat about how CNN Plus totally bombed.
They have no idea what they're doing in this space, and I think it's very revealing.
We've all seen products go on sale only to be discontinued because no one wanted them. We've all seen fast food restaurants churn out abominations that are both unsightly and inedible, and by the grace of God never made it back to the menu past its limited run. We've all seen hideous cars drive down the road, stupid commercials on TV, and completely tone-deaf marketing campaigns. We can all think of corporate mistakes of these sorts, because it's at this point that most of us interact with corporations, the end of the supply chain. The thing is, just as many mistakes, if not more, are made upstream. Your average consumer just isn't aware of them. In fact, a crappy product or service is often the capstone of underlying mistakes within the corporate structure itself. Mistakes are made at every level and in every facet of corporate action, including when corporations lobby the government. As we've seen, Altria's lobbying for regulation was short-sighted, and it's likely come to bite them in the ass with e-cigarettes. The market changed, as did the culture around smoking and vaping, and they failed to anticipate it.